Better? Better, okay. So as I was saying, I'm an attorney at the Conservation Law Foundation. And in running the climate change and clean energy program, I have 14 attorneys that work for me. And we do, basically, all of the work we do is geared towards reducing greenhouse gas emissions from the energy sector. And the way that we do that is we focus not just on policy and the law, but extensively on markets. And Cutler talked a little bit about market design. We strongly believe that market design is one of the routes for undertaking and moving us towards the kind of energy transformation that we need. So of those 14 lawyers, about a quarter of the time is spent focusing on the design of energy markets. About a quarter of the time is spent going after dirty fossil fuel sources, suing coal-fired power plants, that type of work. About a quarter of it is spent trying to advance renewable energy and energy efficiency. So as I speak today, I think there are 3 questions that I'm going to pose as themes to think about. And really they focus on the role of natural gas, and in this instance, in New England's energy system. And those questions are, is natural gas a tool that will facilitate the energy transformation we need from fossil fuels to renewable, non-emitting sources? Is it a tool that will help alleviate threats to the climate change threat, or will it help exacerbate the climate change threat? And will it tend to move us away from or towards a carbon-based economy? So as we move forward, just keep those questions in mind, because hopefully what my discussion will entail is some considerations that will influence the answers. I think we've spoken quite extensively about the amount of unconventional gas that's out there. Virtually all the studies that have come out recently have suggested that notwithstanding a projected tripling of demand, that the commodity price itself is expected to stay low because of the extent of unconventional shale resources that are accessible. Just holding the thought for a minute about whether the price of gas is actually low. So what has the effect of gas been on the electricity system in New England? What has the effect of low-cost gas and the availability been? So this is an ISO New England chart, and it shows 2 things. First, it compares 2000 to 2011. First, with respect to capacity, which is the metal and steel and resources, power plants in the ground that can meet our energy demand, and then it also portrays the actual energy production from various resources. So if you look at the bottom, I guess light blue there, which is natural gas, what you can see is that in 2000, gas was 17.7% of our capacity, but generated 14.7% of the electricity used in New England. In 2011, it was 42.6% of the capacity, but generated 51.3% of the electricity used in New England. Now this chart shows a lot of very interesting information. So who were the losers in that? As gas basically increased its market share. Well, it's pretty clear that coal, compared from 2000 to 2011, lost a substantial amount of market share. Oil all but lost all of its market share. If you look on the far right there, oil in red, it basically didn't generate at all. But also, if you look at wind and other renewables, it really didn't meaningfully gain, at least with respect to the scale of this chart, between 2000 and 2011. And that really is one of the paradoxes that was mentioned earlier by Mike, which is that in some respects, gas is helping to reduce the electric system carbon emissions. In other respects, it's really delaying, through its economic impacts, the ability to deploy new renewable resources. there's another very powerful force going on in New England, and it relates to what some have called the basis problem. And that is, as you know, we have no indigenous gas, little to no indigenous gas resources. Some say there might be small amounts available with respect to unconventional fracking type of production, but really there's little to none. And what are we? We're the end of the pipeline in New England. All the gas that we've used, and in fact I think many people will recall just 4 or 5 years ago, there were at least 5 developers that were still trying to build LNG terminals to import gas into New England. So what we have with the basis problem is really economically one of the most significant issues facing the electricity system and the energy system right now, which is that the commodity of gas, and it's priced, for example, at Henry Hub, there's various hubs that it's priced at, when it doesn't take into account transportation, is often in the $3 to $4 range per decatherm. But the transportation portion of that cost, getting it to New England in the wintertime, can be as much as $10, $12, $14 per decatherm. So gas, while it's relatively plentiful and it's relatively available, many times of the year it's not cheap. And what that is resulting in is that ISO New England, who operates our electric system, is not sure that there's enough gas to maintain reliable service as all of these gas plants gain market share. And so what they end up doing is they actually end up paying coal and oil plants to run at low levels in an operational mode called spinning reserves, to just run there and be ready in case there's not enough gas in the system. So of course to many that would suggest that if we bring more gas into New England and if we build new pipeline infrastructure, we will decrease emissions. And I think we'll get to that question in a second here. You know, the traditional analysis suggests that gas plants are cleaner than coal plants. We know from the standpoint of criteria, traditional air pollutants, whether that's soot, sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxides, mercury, gas essentially doesn't have any sulfur dioxide, mercury, or soot emissions. It does have a small amount of nitrogen oxide emissions. Likewise, when it comes to CO2 or CO2 equivalent, gas is emits roughly half as much as a coal-fired power plant does. And I'm sure many of you have seen the numbers that suggest that due to the shale gas boom, we've seen a very dramatic, as much as 30% reduction in electric industry CO2 emissions. But the question is it really cleaner? And undoubtedly, Professor Howard, who's done a lot of work in this field, would have a strong opinion about this. What this slide shows is a whole slew of analyses that have been done relating to life cycle greenhouse gas emissions from natural gas, starting from production to use. And the more people look at this, the more they conclude that on a life cycle basis, the way that gas is currently produced, the way that it's transported, and the way that it's used, the amount of CO2 reductions attributable to gas replacing coal are rather minimal. By the way, this slide came from an ICF report that was done for the city of New York to determine whether they ought to be expanding their gas infrastructure to replace their heating fuel oil-based system in the buildings for thermal heating in the city. And ultimately, what was interesting about this report is it kind of glossed over the fact that it concluded that switching to biodiesel would provide just as much carbon reductions as would switching to gas. I don't think that's not what the imperative was at the time. So it has been suggested, and there was just a recent study that came out that suggests that gas is not a bridge fuel, and I'm sure you've all heard that phrase before, but rather it is a fuel that's on a bridge to nowhere. And just recently, the National Center for Atmospheric Research came out with a study that in their view confirmed much of what Howarth had concluded in 2011 that the substitution of gas for coal as an energy source results in increased rather than decreased global warming for many decades. And of course, one of the big issues in that regard is leakage. And what's interesting about leakage is we actually don't know how much gas we lose in the system. And at the local distribution level, gas companies are compensated for what's called lost and unaccounted for gas. And they come up with basically a factor that says, the gas went into the system, we don't know where it went, but we still need to get paid for it. And there are many reasons for that. They're not all leaks, some of them are metering issues, but that lost and unaccounted for gas can amount to as much as 10 to 12% of the amount of gas that a local distribution gas company brings into the system. Howard estimates that 3.6 to 7.9% of methane is lost at the production stage, and that's both through leaks and through flaring, and the National Center's analysis used an estimate of 10% leakage on a life cycle basis. The bottom line, and this is a pretty widely held opinion, is that unless leakage rates for new methane can be kept below 2% on a life cycle basis, substituting gas for coal is not an effective means for reducing the magnitude of future climate change. So, is gas part of the solution or is it part of the problem? This is a quick graphical representation, pictorial representation of the production, distribution, and consumption system, looking at where the methane is lost throughout that cycle, and it's relatively evenly divided as between the three steps in the production and use phase. And clearly there are many opportunities to reduce these leaks. EPA has recently issued regulations that would start that process at the production level. We'll talk a little bit more about that at the distribution level. The other challenge with gas is if we accept, as I think many of us do, that, and in fact the law of Massachusetts does, that there is essentially a need to decarbonize the energy system in order to mitigate and limit the effects of climate change. And under Massachusetts law, it's required that greenhouse gas emissions be reduced 80% by 2050. It raises the question of how does a carbon-based fuel lead to that outcome? And here's where the challenge comes in. It's one thing to suggest that by replacing coal-fired power plants, we're seeing reductions in GHG emissions coming out of the stack. But as we move forward and seek to decarbonize the energy system, building new gas infrastructure is not going to be consistent with taking all the carbon out of our energy system. And here's why. For example, when a new pipeline is built, and this is really one of the, FERC has been holding, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission has been holding a series of technical conferences in New England about how do we build more pipeline capacity in New England to address the basis problem. Well, I raised my hand in one of those technical sessions and said, what is your expected useful life of a new pipeline? And they said 80 to 100 years. Well, sometime around 2050, the energy system is supposed to be decarbonized, really as a matter of law, let alone policy. And what is the useful life of a new natural gas-fired power plant? 30 to 40 years. And what's the period by which a new gas pipeline is depreciated? 20 to 30 years. So it's pretty clear that what might appear to some to be on the right side of the carbon curve now will very quickly be on the wrong side of the carbon curve. And this is really a vexing problem when you think about the example I stated before, where ISO New England is running at low levels coal and oil plants, highly inefficient plants running in their least efficient operating mode, because there isn't enough gas supply for them to ensure reliability. You know, to argue against the wisdom of building new gas infrastructure is, at least in the public sphere, somewhat of an uphill battle right now. So I just wanted to provide a little bit of CLF's perspective on this question. CLF and more recently me within CLF, we've spent a fair amount of time and resources trying to move these bunkered coal-fired power plants out of the system. Plants that have outlived their useful lives by their estimated or initially estimated useful lives by 20 or 30 years or more. So if you look at this chart, what this chart depicts is that this period, March 2012 through May 2012, with one slight exception, is the first extended period that we have been able to find where in the ISO New England market, wind generation was significantly more than coal generation. And the market, when it started in about 2000. And that clearly is a reflection of what gas prices, the impact that gas prices are having in the market. So our perspective on this is that gas is not a niche fuel, is not a bridge fuel, but rather it's a niche fuel. And it has an important role, and Mike spoke about this earlier, of finally replacing the coal-fired power plants that really have been the primary source of electricity in the country for the better part of the last 40 years. The plain fact of the matter is that coal-fired power plants are dead right now in this market. We've seen 3 of the 8 in the New England market exit within the last 3 years. It is virtually unprecedented, with the possible exception of the 1973 energy crisis, where you've seen a time when coal plant capacity factors, that is the amount of power that they are generating versus their maximum capability to generate power, have been reduced to such a great extent and then somehow miraculously come back. It's not going to happen. And in fact, I would take it a step further. Once they start functioning in an operating mode along these lines as inefficient peaking units that are just there to serve this reliability need, they can't operate in a way that keeps them in compliance with environmental laws, and they certainly can't operate cost effectively. So one way to look at this might be that natural gas is providing a role in moving the dirty, obsolete first and second generation fossil fuel power plants out of the system. There are some who would suggest that it has another role. And I'm not sure if anybody has discussed the European Climate Foundation Roadmap 2050. But what they did in Europe was they convened a large group of all of the major utilities, the NGOs, the environmental and energy advocates, government officials, and based on their codified requirements to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from their energy system, they tried to design a roadmap for how they would do that. And a lot of the companies that who Cutler had their logos at the end of his presentation, many of those companies participated in this process. Not surprisingly, a fair amount of them dropped out during the course of the process. But one of the findings that they came up with was that there is a limited role for gas going into the future in order to facilitate decarbonization besides the one that I just spoke about. And in fact, the European Climate Foundation Roadmap still has gas plants operating in 2050, although after 2030 it has their greenhouse gas emissions being sequestered through carbon capture and sequestration, which of course from a technological and financial standpoint is a big if right now. But more importantly, what they determined was that as more variable renewable resources come online, and we're talking about wind and solar, which we have no means of controlling the sun or the wind. So as the system relies more and more on those variable resources, there needs to be some sort of firming resource in the system. And that's a role that natural gas can play if it's done correctly. And I'll talk about that in a minute. In other words, if there are quick start gas facilities that ramp up when there is variability in the system in order to maintain voltage stability and power flows. It's a role that natural gas can play and that the European Climate Foundation determined it should play. By the way, big hydro is another resource which has greenhouse gas ramifications of its own from inundation that also can play that role. And so what that means is that rather than running as a baseload plant, or rather than having a high capacity factor throughout the year, in other words, generating at a consistent level, it would be starting up and stopping and ramping up and down literally hundreds of times in the course of a year. And what this chart depicts are the hours, 8,762 hours per year, and a natural gas fleet load factor over the course of those years. And what you can see is it's going up, down, starting, shutting down, and basically supporting the deployment of much greater levels of renewable resources in Europe. And it should be noted that the New England system is not that different than the European system, especially with respect to big hydro resources in the north, and in Europe the solar resources tend to be in the south, they tend to be more in the west, but there are some similarities. So I guess from our standpoint, there might be a role for natural gas in decarbonizing, but it's a limited role and it's a niche role. And the truth is that the way the markets are designed, there's nothing that suggests that they will ever be playing that role because they're not compensated to play that role. So in the first instance, if lower gas costs are going to be something that, I guess from our perspective, we're not getting the genie back in the bottle here. For the time being, if we are going to facilitate a role for gas, there needs to be very significant market changes, and that role needs to be focused on supporting variable resources. And actually, ISO New England, who operates the New England power grid and has a reputation around the country of being one of the more forward-thinking grid operators, at least in comparison to some of their friends, their brethren in the Southeast. They've been experimenting with market designs and trying to develop market designs that would basically support a role like this, that would support more flexible resources, and essentially would allow the more than 8,000 megawatts, the 1/3 of the entire capacity fleet in New England that's in jeopardy. It's in, some might call it economic jeopardy. I would call it obsolescence jeopardy. The oil and the coal plants, like I said, their days are numbered. They're all 50, 60, 70 years old. So ISO New England is looking in the midst of this energy transformation of how they can set up a system that can provide for some of these roles. Of course, without a price on carbon, or at least a significant, meaningful price on carbon, it's much more difficult to do that. How am I doing on time here? 5 minutes? Okay. So the other aspect of this that we spoke about was the gas infrastructure, this big push to develop new gas infrastructure. And here is our perspective on how to deal with that. We think that we need to avoid new long-term infrastructure, and we think that there is a means to use the existing infrastructure much more effectively as a basis to maintain reliability, to maintain viable economic competition in the markets. I certainly was not an expert on gas markets and don't claim to be, but what we have come to learn is, in essence, what is a pipeline? A pipeline not only is a conduit for fuel, it's a huge storage device for fuel. And the way those pipelines are operated, they pack the pipelines 4 to 6 hours before, depending on, assuming that the gas is moving 20 miles per hour through the pipeline, the pipe is packed to store the gas, and then the flow is removed by the end user. And one of the interesting things about New England is we have 2 to 3 times as much natural gas storage capacity as the highest peak load day in the region. We just don't use it in a very robust way. So from our standpoint, some of the solutions that we need to be pursuing on the short term, rather than building new long-term infrastructure that is inconsistent with climate goals, is we need to develop new market designs and operational mechanisms for the system that allow the reliability needs to be satisfied without building new infrastructure. And there are ways to do that, but let me be pretty blunt about this. The pipelines are not particularly interested in those ways. The way that they are regulated by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, all they need to show is someone wants to buy gas here and someone wants to supply gas here, and that essentially has been sufficient for them to get FERC authorization to build new pipelines. We think there's a huge risk that any new pipeline infrastructure is going to be stranded, that ultimately consumers are going to bear the cost of it, and because it's inconsistent with climate goals, it's not even going to get used. So storage capacity, new products and services to support flexible resources. What that means is rather than forcing consumers to buy firm gas, which is the way that they like to do it, that they could provide some products that allow consumers, gas power plants, more variability in their load, so they don't have to commit to firm gas, so that if they're not using the gas, or we can avoid the use of that gas, it's not being paid for. And then, of course, there's energy efficiency, and this is both on the thermal side and on the electric side. We are at a period of time in New England where energy efficiency equates to reliability and it equates to reducing carbon. And obviously there are not significant commercial stakeholders that are always able to prevail in that regard, but from our perspective, before we're going to see significant new gas infrastructure permitted, there is going to be a detailed financial analysis about the alternatives as it relates to energy efficiency. And here's why. What this chart shows is, it basically shows, if you look at the horizontal axis, you see that the months, there's 2 for every year, 1 in July and 1 in January. And the peaks of each one of the curves is the amount of gas that's available in that year for electric generation in the summer. And the trough in each one of those years is the amount of gas that's available in electric generation in the winter. And obviously what this is showing is that gas availability is constrained in the winter because of all the thermal heating load that gas serves in the region. So we did some analysis, and what we found was that if only 30% of the cost-effective energy efficiency opportunities were deployed just in residences, then the amount of gas available in the winter would be just about equivalent to the amount of gas that's available in the summer for electric generation. In other words, energy efficiency will avoid the costs and the emissions associated with new gas consumption. Lastly, and CLF just issued this report on leaks that we actually did cooperatively with Boston University. The amount of leaks that are coming out of the distribution system in an old system like Boston are really quite astounding. And when you look at, for example, the greenhouse gas inventory in Massachusetts, you find that as much as 4% of Massachusetts greenhouse gas emissions, and we know that methane is a much more potent greenhouse gas than CO2, are attributable solely to leaks in the Boston local distribution system. In fact, we are losing more energy and gas through leaks on an annual basis, substantially more, if you look at the yellow slide, than we are saving through the investments in energy efficiency in the system. So basically, using the current infrastructure more efficiently, deploying energy efficiency, coming up with new market designs and models to use it more robustly. These are some of the kinds of activities that we think are required as part of this expansion of natural gas. And ultimately, where are we? We're trying to move from this, which is a fuels chart showing the 2010 mix of fuels, and as you can see, it's dominated by natural gas and nuclear, and to a lesser extent, coal and hydro. This is the New England electric system, to how we get to this scenario in 2050. And as has been pointed out, this very well is likely to take a technology to be determined. but I don't think we can count on that. And if you look at this chart, what you see is that energy efficiency gains provide for 21% of the capacity gains, so to speak, to get there in 2050. So I guess I'll leave it for questions and answers. I haven't really laid out a firm opinion. I know I've kind of gone both ways. Is gas part of the solution, or is gas part of the problem? Thank you very much.